They told the police I was losing my mind. But the first question the officer asked had nothing to do with memory tests or medication. He wanted to know who had been paying the property taxes on my house since 1983. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. I stood barefoot in the doorway of my home on Willow Creek Drive, a half-peeled apple still in my hand, while Officer Ryan Cole studied me carefully and asked whether I still recognized my own name. Behind him stood my daughter Angela and her husband, Brian Keller. Angela wore the kind of practiced concern meant to look convincing from a distance. Brian avoided my eyes completely, one hand gripping a worn manila folder too tightly against his chest. For a second, I honestly thought there had been some kind of mistake. Then Ryan glanced down at his notebook again. "Mrs. Sanders," he said carefully, "we received a report that you may not be safely managing things on your own. We required to check on your well-being. Would it be all right if we came inside?" Required. That word usually means someone else has already started making decisions about your life. And suddenly, this no longer felt like a wellness check. My name is Marilyn Sanders. I was 76 years old, and until that morning, I never imagined my own daughter would try to convince people I could no longer manage my own life. If you re-listening tonight, tell me where you re-watching from. And stay with me, because what Officer Cole discovered inside that house changed everything. I thought I understood about my family. I realized someone had already begun building a version of my future where I no longer had authority over it. I stepped aside without arguing. The house smelled faintly of apples and boiling water. The kettle was still warm. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen windows, while the old refrigerator hummed softly against the silence. Still, I knew Angela probably saw the faded wallpaper in the hallway as proof that I was somehow declining. She walked in with a sigh that sounded rehearsed. Ryan stayed near the doorway, shoulders stiff, barely speaking. Ryan watched my face closely, almost waiting for confusion to reveal itself. Instead, I handed him the apple. "If you worried about my coordination," I said, "you're welcome to finish peeling that." He blinked, caught off guard for half a second, before the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Angela didn't smile. "She forgets things sometimes," she said softly. "Leaves the stove on. Misplaces paperwork. We were worried about her." It was the kind of voice people use when they want to sound caring, while quietly building a case against you. Ryan turned back toward me. "Do you handle your own finances, ma'am?" The question itself wasn't cruel, just procedural. Still, I felt something tighten low in my chest. "I've personally paid every property tax bill on this house since 1983, I said calmly. "In person?" Angela's expression shifted immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Brian cleared his throat and muttered something about misunderstandings. But Ryan's attention had already sharpened. He asked if he could walk through the house to check for safety concerns. Kitchen, hallway, living room. Angela followed beside him the entire time, pointing out every squeaky hinge and chipped corner, like evidence she'd been waiting to present. I stayed quiet and watched. Ryan noticed the lined-up shoes near the door, the crossword puzzle half finished beside my reading glasses, the labeled jars in the pantry. Routine, structure, a life still fully lived. Nothing about the house suggested confusion. Back in the living room, he paused before asking the question that finally exposed what this visit was really about. "So who normally handles your bills now, Mrs. Sanders?" "I do," I answered evenly. "Every month." Then after a short pause, I added, "Unless someone has filed something different behind my back." Angela went pale. Brian suddenly seemed very interested in the floorboards. And right then, Ryan understood this situation had very little to do with my safety. It had to do with control. Sitting there listening to them discuss my life, like I was already disappearing, was one of the strangest feelings Ivy ever experienced. Tell me honestly, could you forgive family for filing something like this behind your back? Because what I discovered after that meeting changed everything. He closed his notebook slowly. His posture relaxed slightly, but his eyes became more focused. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Everyone felt it. Angela brushed invisible lint from her sleeve, an old nervous habit she had since childhood whenever things stopped going her way. Mrs. Sanders, Ryan said after clearing his throat, I'd like to ask you a few questions privately, if that's all right. Angela immediately started to object, but he stopped her with one raised hand. Calm, authority. No performance needed. I motioned toward the kitchen and walked ahead of him, careful and composed. Behind us, I heard Angela whisper something sharp and hurried to Brian. Whatever version of me they expected him to find was beginning to fall apart. When we sat down at the kitchen table, Ryan lowered his voice. Ma'am, he said quietly. Something about this situation doesn't add up. There was no pity in his tone, just honesty. And somehow, that felt heavier, because deep down, I had already begun understanding the truth for myself. This wasn't a concern. This was my family, trying to move me out of my own life, while I was still standing in it. Ryan rested his forearms lightly against the table, respectful of the space. Mrs. Sanders, I need to ask you a few direct questions. I nodded once. Ask? From the living room, I could still hear Angela and Brian whispering tensely to each other. Have you had any recent falls? He asked. Memory problems? Missed appointments? Anything concerning? No. He gave me a moment, as though waiting to see if I'd change my answer. I haven't, I repeated. His expression remained neutral, thoughtful. Have you authorized anyone else to manage your finances? By then, I could already tell. He suspected more than he was saying. No, I answered. I've always handled my own accounts myself. He nodded slowly. Your daughter mentioned you've misplaced important documents recently. Is that true? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. Officer, I've kept every tax receipt, insurance form, and financial record in labeled folders for over 40 years. Color-coded. I paused briefly. The only thing I lose these days is patience. A small smile crossed his face, before footsteps approached the doorway. Angela appeared again. Tense and controlled. Everything okay in here? We were only trying to help her. That's generous of you, I said quietly. She gave me the same look people use when they've already decided someone can no longer be reasoned with. Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ryan kept his attention on me. Mrs. Sanders, would you mind showing me those records? Of course. I stood and led him toward the study. Angela stepped forward instinctively as if she intended to guide me, but I waved her off. I'm fine, I said. I can walk. The study carried the faint smell of old paper and lemon polish. I opened the cabinet beside my desk and pulled out the thick blue ledger binder I'd kept for decades. Property taxes, I said, placing it in his hands. 1983 through last quarter. Ryan opened it slowly. Page after page. Dates. Receipts. Confirmation numbers. My handwriting remained neat and steady throughout every year. Angela lingered near the doorway, twisting her fingers together. How do you even remember all this? She asked quietly. I didn't look at her. Because I live here, I said simply. And I care about what belongs to me. Ryan paused at an entry from years earlier. These were paid in person. Yes, I answered. People tend to handle your paperwork more carefully when they recognize your face. He murmured softly under his breath before closing the binder again. Then he looked back at me. Mrs. Sanders, he said carefully, you appear fully capable of managing your own affairs. Angela's voice sharpened immediately. She has good days, Angela said quickly. She can sound completely normal, even when she isn't. It changes. For the first time since stepping into my house, Officer Ryan Cole turned toward her fully. His expression didn't harden. If anything, it became more careful. Is that so? He asked evenly. Because everything I've observed today suggests stable judgment. Ryan stepped forward beside her, shoulders tense. We were worried she'll miss something important, he said. Taxes, utilities, the house itself. Problems build slowly at her age. We were trying to stay ahead of it. Funny how people suddenly become protective when property enters the conversation. I kept my tone level. Officer, earlier they mentioned unpaid taxes. Did they tell you which ones? Ryan glanced at the notes in his hand. They claimed there had been lapses over the last several years. Which years? I asked. Neither of them answered. Ryan looked between us before letting out a slow breath. Mrs. Sanders, nothing in these records shows missed payments. Angela flushed immediately. Maybe something recent slipped through, she said. Recent? I repeated. I paid last quarter in person. I spent 10 minutes talking with the clerk about her grandson being born. Ryan closed the blue ledger binder and rested one hand over it. I am not seeing evidence of neglect or cognitive decline, he said. Then after a brief pause. But I need to ask you something important. The tension in the room changed instantly. Has anyone pressured you to transfer property, financial responsibility, or legal authority? No one moved. No one spoke. My heartbeat stayed steady, but something older inside me finally stopped trying to soften the truth. Ryan waited patiently. Not pushing. Not rescuing me either. Just giving me space to answer honestly. Angela shifted beside the doorway. Brian's jaw flexed hard enough to show through his cheek. I asked. Ryan said gently, whether anyone has pressured you regarding your affairs. My fingers rested against the binder. 40 years of receipts sat beneath my hand. Taxes, insurance records, utility payments. Decades of proof that I was still fully present in my own life. I looked at Angela before speaking. She stared at the floor. I haven't signed anything over, I said carefully. But there have been discussions. Ryan nodded once. What kind of discussions? They've encouraged me to prepare early, I said. To simplify things. To protect myself. I tapped the binder softly. But underneath all of that was this house. Access to it. Control over what happens to it. Angela lifted her head sharply. Mom, that's unfair. Before what? I asked quietly. Her expression tightened. Before something happens. But nothing has happened, I replied. That seems to be the part everyone skips. She tried to speak again, but Ryan stopped her with a small motion of his hand. I need to understand the legal side of this, he said to me. Has anyone filed paperwork seeking authority over your affairs? I hesitated. Not because I didn't know. Because until then, I hadn't fully allowed myself to connect the pieces. About a month earlier, I'd received a notice from the King County Property Probate Office requesting additional documentation tied to a competency verification regarding property matters. At the time, it had seemed unusual but harmless. Now it felt very different. I received a notice requesting competency verification connected to property filings. I said slowly. I never initiated it. Ryan's attention sharpened immediately. Do you still have the letter? Yes. I retrieved another folder from the desk drawer and handed it to him. He read every page carefully. When he finished, his eyes moved first to me, then toward Angela and Brian. This filing did not come from the county, he said. It was initiated externally by a family member. Angela exhaled hard. We were trying to help. Ryan interrupted before she could continue. A cognitive capacity petition is not informal paperwork, he said calmly. It's a legal process that can remove decision-making authority from the property owner. Ryan's voice tightened. You're making it sound sinister. We didn't think she understood all the paperwork involved. We were trying to be proactive. Proactive, I repeated quietly. That's one word for it. Ryan returned the letter to the folder with measured care. Mrs. Sanders, he said. Based on everything I've reviewed today, I see no evidence suggesting you are unable to manage your finances, your property, or your personal safety. Then he faced them directly. And I want to be absolutely clear. Attempting to obtain legal authority over a competent adult without legitimate grounds is a serious misuse of the process. Angela's face turned blotchy red. She gets confused sometimes. She is 76. I'm 76, I answered, not incapable. The room fell silent again. Ryan stood and adjusted the binder beneath his arm. I'll complete my report this afternoon, he said. Mrs. Sanders, I may need to follow up tomorrow with a few additional questions. You're welcome to, I replied. For now, he continued, you remain fully within your legal rights, and I have not seen evidence of incompetence or immediate risk. Angela stepped forward. So that's it. You just believe her. Ryan held her gaze steadily. I believe documentation, he said. Her records are consistent. Your claims are not. Ryan exhaled sharply under his breath. This is unbelievable. We were trying to prevent a disaster. Ryan shook his head once. What I am seeing is unnecessary pressure placed on a capable adult. Pressure. Such a restrained word for something that had slowly been tightening around my life for months. I placed the folder carefully back into the drawer. Officer Cole, I said quietly, thank you. He met my eyes, and something inside me eased for the first time that morning. Not because I felt rescued. Because someone had finally looked at the facts instead of my age. I may return tomorrow, Ryan said. There are still a few details I need to verify. You're welcome anytime. Angela opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Ryan walked toward the front door, with the binder tucked beneath his arm, and I felt the atmosphere inside the house shift slightly around us. Subtle, but undeniable. For the first time in months, I no longer felt outnumbered inside my own home. Ryan paused near the doorway before leaving. If anyone contacts you about legal paperwork, he said, call the station directly. I will. His eyes moved briefly toward Angela and Brian. Not accusing anymore. Just informed. And keep those records secured, he added. I intend to. He gave a small nod and stepped outside. The front door closed softly behind him. And the silence left behind inside the house carried far more strain than peace. I remained near the front door, after Officer Ryan Cole left, waiting to see which of them would speak first. It was Angela. It was usually Angela. Mom, what were you thinking? She burst out. You made us look manipulative in front of a police officer. He practically accused us of lying. I didn't make you look like anything, I replied calmly. I answered his questions honestly. Brian let out a quiet scoff. You talked about us like we were trying to take advantage of you. I looked at him carefully then. The stiffness in his shoulders. The irritation he was no longer bothering to hide. You filed a cognitive capacity petition behind my back, I said. What exactly should I call that? Angela lifted both hands in frustration. We were trying to help you. You're getting older. Sometimes you miss calls. You forget to call people back. We worry. You worry, I repeated softly. Because I don't respond quickly enough. That isn't concern, Angela. That's frustration. Her mouth tightened immediately. You don't understand how fast things can spiral. One mistake. I haven't made one, I interrupted. Not with my taxes. Not with my finances. Not with this house. You decided I was struggling long before there was any proof. Brian stepped forward slightly. We just thought it was time to start planning ahead. Planning ahead requires transparency, I said. Not paperwork filed without my knowledge. The room settled into a strained silence. Sunlight stretched across the rug between us in a warm stripe, dividing the room almost perfectly. Angela's eyes drifted toward the study doorway, where the blue ledger binder still sat on the desk. I could see the disappointment on her face now. She had expected Officer Cole to find confusion, late bills, missed payments, evidence. Instead, he found records organized down to the last receipt. A woman still fully aware of her own affairs. When Angela spoke again, her tone had softened. "Mom, you're remaking this more difficult than it needs to be. We're trying to help before something bad happens." "But nothing has happened," I said evenly. "And until it does, I don't need people stepping in to manage my life. I need honesty, respect." Brian glanced toward the door, already looking exhausted. "Maybe we should leave and come back later." "Yes," I said. "I think you should." Angela hesitated. For a second, she looked caught between continuing the argument and walking away from it altogether. Then something in my expression must have answered the question for her. She picked up her coat slowly. At the doorway, she paused. "We only wanted what was best for you." I held her gaze. "Then start wanting it without trying to control me." She didn't respond. A minute later, they were backing out of the driveway without another word. The house settled after they left. Not empty this time. Lighter somehow. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself another cup of tea, and sat quietly while sunlight moved across the floorboards inch by inch. For the first time in months, the air inside my home no longer felt crowded by someone else's expectations. The difference was subtle, but I felt it immediately. Of course, peace never lasts very long once resentment has been stirred up. Less than 10 minutes later, my phone began buzzing. One message, then another, then another. Angela had regained her confidence, now that she no longer had to stand in front of me while speaking. The first text read, "You embarrassed us in front of the police." The second, "You made us sound greedy." The third was longer. "This is what happens when people try to help you." I stared at the screen for a few seconds without anger. Mostly because none of it surprised me anymore. Some people offer help the way banks offer loans. There's always repayment attached somewhere underneath. I turned the phone face down and poured fresh tea into my cup. It tasted noticeably lighter, without someone hovering over my decisions. Around noon, I stepped out onto the porch. The late morning warmth settled gently against my skin. Angela believed I could no longer manage a household. What she forgot was that I had managed an entire life. I'd survived illness, work, bills, loneliness, lost years of it. Frailty was never the real issue. Convenience was. I watered the geraniums, swept the porch, trimmed the dying stems from the flower boxes. Not to prove anything to anyone, but I understood now that simply remaining visible mattered more than people realized. Neighbors waved as they passed. Nancy Whitmore stopped near the sidewalk to talk about the weather and her tomatoes for a few minutes. She spoke to me exactly the way she always had. No careful tone. No pity. No searching my face for signs of decline. Oddly enough, that steadied me more than sympathy would have. When I stepped back inside, the faint smell of pine cleaner lingered in the kitchen. I'd started wiping down the counters, without even noticing. Habit more than intention. The kind formed after decades of caring for your own home. Angela's words drifted back through my mind. "You're remaking this harder than it needs to be." If only she understood that simplicity is not something children grant their parents. It's something parents earn after years spent carrying everyone else. Late that afternoon, the phone rang again. This time I answered. "Mom, we need to talk," Angela said immediately. "I thought we already had." She ignored that completely. "Do you understand how serious this is? Officer Cole basically implied we did something illegal." "I didn't give him that impression," I replied quietly. "You gave him the documents. He simply read them." A long breath crackled through the phone. "We were trying to stop things from falling apart." "Things aren't falling apart," I said. "You just don't like that they aren't arranged the way you expected." Silence followed. Dense. Uncomfortable. Angela wasn't accustomed to hearing the same direct honesty she used on everyone else. Finally, she said, "Why are you suddenly being so difficult? You never questioned us before." "That's because," I answered, "I kept believing you still saw me as your mother instead of a problem to organize." The pause after that felt heavier. Then her voice sharpened. "Fine. Handle everything yourself. But don't expect us to rescue you when something goes wrong." "I won't," I said calmly. She hung up. I remained standing there for a moment with one hand resting lightly against the counter. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel defeated either. Just awake in a way I had to been for a long time. They weren't upset because I embarrassed them. They were upset because I had stopped making myself smaller for their comfort. Outside, evening light stretched across the kitchen floor in long golden bands. I rinsed my teacup, returned it carefully to the shelf, and stood there listening to the quiet around me. Whatever came next, I would face it the same way I had survived everything else in my life. Fully aware, standing upright, and no longer willing to hand my voice over to someone else. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual with a heaviness sitting quietly in my chest. It wasn't panic exactly, more like clarity arriving before I was ready for it. By the time sunlight reached the kitchen windows, I already understood that indignation alone would not protect me. Feelings mean very little to people who have already started treating you as replaceable. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and called a number I hadn't used in years. Jonathan Reeves. The son of my old neighbor, now an attorney with Reeves Carter Elder Law Group in downtown Seattle. Years ago, he once joked with me at a neighborhood barbecue, "If you ever need a lawyer, Mrs. Sanders, call me before things become complicated." Well, this certainly qualified. He answered on the second ring. "Jonathan Reeves speaking." "Jonathan, this is Marilyn Sanders. I'm sorry to bother you." There was a brief pause before recognition warmed his voice. "Mrs. Sanders, you could never bother me. What's going on?" I took a slow breath. "I need to understand my rights," I said. "And I need to make sure nobody tries to step around them again." He didn't interrupt while I explained everything. The police visit, Angela and Brian's statements, the cognitive capacity petition filed without my knowledge. I told it plainly. No dramatics. No exaggeration. At my age, facts carry enough weight on their own. When I finished, Jonathan exhaled quietly. "You absolutely did the right thing by calling me," he said. "Filing competency paperwork without medical evidence is deeply inappropriate. At best, it's a misuse of the system. It's not the paperwork itself that frightens me," I admitted. "It's how easily they were willing to pretend I was fading." His tone softened. "I understand." Then after a pause, "I'd like to see you today. Bring any documents you have. We'll go over everything carefully. Are you available around 2? "Yes," I said immediately. Waiting would only leave too much room for worry to settle in. After hanging up, I changed into a clean blouse and brushed my hair carefully until it sat neatly against my shoulders. I wasn't dressing for Jonathan. I was dressing for myself. For the version of me that still believed dignity mattered, especially when defending your own life. The bus ride into Seattle was long and steady, giving me too much time to think. People assume older women move through life half distracted, but age sharpens certain instincts. You learn to recognize danger long before it arrives openly at your front door. Jonathan greeted me warmly. When I arrived at his office, he had grown into a serious-looking man over the years, but his smile still carried the same earnestness I remembered from when he was young. He offered me tea, sat across from me at a polished conference table, and opened a legal pad. "Let's start with the basics," he said. "Do you currently have any active powers of attorney?" "No," I answered. "And I'd like to keep it that way." "Good," he made a note. Do Angela or Brian have access to any bank accounts? No. And the house on Willow Creek Drive? Still solely under your name? Yes. A faint smile crossed his face. Then legally, you're in a strong position already. I felt some of the pressure inside my chest ease. But Jonathan continued carefully. That said, I do think it's important to reinforce your protections now. Not because you're incapable, but because they've shown a willingness to test boundaries. He explained my options one by one. Updating my will. Establishing the Sanders Family Protective Trust. Filing formal instructions with the King County Property Probate Office requiring that any future competency inquiries come directly through me and my attorney. Every step felt like adding another lock to a door I had realized people were already trying to open. At one point, Jonathan looked up from his notes. Have they pressured you before? He asked carefully. Financially or emotionally? I thought about that for a moment. Not in ways that leave bruises, I said quietly, but enough to leave impressions. He understood exactly what I meant. By the time he finished outlining everything, something inside me felt steadier. I didn't feel triumphant or angry. Just steadier than I had in a long time. Like I was finally reclaiming space. I had slowly surrendered without noticing. I'll prepare the paperwork this afternoon, Jonathan said. You'll remain fully in control, with safeguards in place against interference. Then he added gently, it's your life, Mrs. Sanders. We're simply making sure the law recognizes that. When I left his office later that afternoon, my steps felt firmer than they had that morning. Outside, Seattle sunlight warmed my face as I walked toward the bus stop. And somewhere between the office building and the corner crosswalk, I realized something simple. I wasn't protecting myself because I was afraid. I was protecting myself because I had finally remembered I deserve protection too. By the time I returned home, late afternoon light had settled softly across the house. I set my bag down near the hallway table and walked slowly from room to room, almost as if I were checking the shape of my own life after a storm. Nothing inside the house had changed. But I had. Strength rarely changes the world around you immediately. Mostly, it changes how you stand inside it. My phone buzzed again. I let it ring twice before checking the voicemail. Angela's voice came through tight and controlled. Mom, we heard you went to see a lawyer. This is unnecessary. You're re-escalating things. Please call us back so we can work this out. Work this out. What she meant was, return to the arrangement they preferred. I didn't call back. Instead, I sat at the dining table and unlocked the metal box where I kept decades of financial records, bank statements, insurance summaries, tax receipts, an entire lifetime preserved in orderly stacks of paper. As I sorted through them, I began noticing patterns I had ignored for years. Small withdrawals labeled emergencies. Temporary help that quietly became permanent expectation. Responsibility shifting little by little onto my shoulders, while gratitude slowly disappeared from theirs. There was no dramatic theft hidden inside those records. Only something slower. A steady assumption that what belonged to me would eventually belong to them too. And for years, I had mistaken generosity for love. Now I understood something different. Generosity, without boundaries, eventually teaches people to walk through you without knocking. I made notes for Jonathan, accounts to secure, payments to reorganize, property records to verify. My handwriting remained neat and controlled throughout all of it. Age had not taken my judgment. People had simply become too comfortable pretending otherwise. Late that afternoon, I stepped outside to collect the mail. Most of it was ordinary until I noticed an envelope from the King County Property Probate Office. Something tightened low in my stomach. Not fear, recognition. I opened it right there on the porch. Inside was a formal notice stating that the recent competency review request tied to my property records had been temporarily placed on hold pending further verification. There it was. Proof. Someone had already pushed this process farther than they admitted. And if Officer Ryan Cole hadn't asked the right questions the day before, I might never have known how close they had come to pulling my life out from under me. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my pocket. This wasn't panic anymore. This was clarity. I walked back into the house with the calm of someone who had finally seen the edge beneath her feet and stepped back before anyone else could push her forward. The phone rang again. Angela, persistent now. I let it ring until it stopped. And when the house settled again afterward, the feeling that remained wasn't passive peace anymore. It was resolve. I sat beside the window watching evening light gather slowly across the yard. Whatever Angela and Brian planned next, I was no longer the woman quietly waiting for their goodwill. Now I had records, witnesses, a lawyer, and this time, I intended to use every one of them. Jonathan paused for a moment on the phone, before saying quietly, "You sound certain." "I am. And for the first time in days, I truly meant it." He walked me carefully through the next steps, revoking every informal permission anyone might try to lean on later. Filing formal notice with the King County Property Probate Office, blocking any future competency inquiries, unless they came directly through me. Restructuring my banking access, so no one could reach my accounts through guesses, assumptions, or family familiarity. Then he recommended moving my key assets into the Sanders Family Protective Trust, with me remaining sole controller. "This isn't about cutting your family out," Jonathan said gently. "It's about protecting your independence." "I understand," I replied. And I did. He emailed the documents over within the hour. I read every page carefully before signing. Each signature felt strangely calming. Not dramatic. Just final. Like setting down burdens I had realized I'd been carrying for years. Quiet obligations. Careful compromises. The exhausting habit of making myself smaller to keep everyone else comfortable. When I sent the paperwork back, Jonathan confirmed he would begin filing immediately. That cognitive capacity petition they submitted will become effectively unusable once our notice is processed, he explained. Without medical evidence, they won't be able to pursue another filing. And from what you've described, they certainly don't have grounds. For the first time since Officer Ryan Cole knocked on my front door, I felt something close to appreciation for the system itself. Not because it was perfect, but because it still had structure. And structure matters when people start trying to rewrite your life for you. After lunch, I walked slowly through the house, touching familiar surfaces as I passed. The stair railing I'd depolished for decades. The kitchen counter worn smooth from years of baking. The window frames I had painted myself after my husband passed away. People often think independence is measured by physical strength. It isn't. Real independence is knowing what belongs to you because you spent years protecting it, maintaining it, and carrying its weight yourself. This house was never just property. It was continuity. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone rang again. I expected Angela. Instead, it was Jonathan. "One more thing," he said. "I officially filed revocation notices regarding any prior attempts to seek authority over your estate. The county will now list Angela Sanders and Brian Keller as non-eligible petitioners unless you personally approve otherwise." I closed my eyes briefly and let the meaning settle in. "Thank you, it's protection," he reminded me. "And you deserve that." After we hung up, I stepped outside onto the porch. The sky above Bellevue was clear, the neighborhood unusually calm. Across the street, a delivery driver carried a package toward someone's front steps. A woman walked her dog past my yard without noticing me at all. Ordinary life continuing untouched while people elsewhere tried to force small, private storms into existence. My phone buzzed again. Angela? We need to talk. You returning this into something hostile. I stared at the message for a moment without responding. Defending myself wasn't hostility. Telling police I was mentally slipping so they could move faster toward controlling my estate. That was hostility. I slipped the phone into my pocket and went back inside. The completed legal packet rested in the drawer beside my bed. My drawer. My bedroom. My home on Willow Creek Drive. For the first time in months, I no longer felt exposed inside my own life. Whatever Angela and Brian believed about my age or my mind no longer mattered. The law no longer leaned in their favor, and neither did I. By the following morning, the backlash had fully begun. Angela called twice before 8 o'clock, letting the phone ring long enough to fill the house with tension. When I didn't answer, the messages started instead. Long texts about misunderstandings, about hurt feelings, about how I had misread their intentions. I read every one of them without replying. There had been no misunderstanding. What they were grieving wasn't trust. It was access. Around 10, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked through the blinds and saw Brian stepping out, shoulders rigid, jaw already tight. He hadn't come to apologize. He had come angry. When I opened the front door, he skipped hello entirely. We need to clear the air, he said immediately. You've taken this way too far. I stayed where I was, neither inviting him inside nor shutting the door. I've taken exactly the steps I needed to take. He rubbed the back of his neck, preparing himself for the kind of argument he clearly believed he could still win. Jonathan Reeves called us, he said. He told us you restricted our ability to help you. You made us sound like we were exploiting you. That's closer to the truth than what you told Officer Cole. His expression tightened instantly. You retwisting everything, he snapped. We weren't trying to control you. We were trying to make sure things didn't fall apart. Nothing here has ever fallen apart, I said calmly. Not once. Your concern only intensified when the house became part of the conversation. He looked away briefly, just long enough. Look, he said, softening his tone as he changed tactics. We love you. You know that. But all this legal stuff is making things uncomfortable. For who? I asked. You or me? He didn't answer. I've managed my own affairs for nearly 8 decades. I continued. You filed a competency review behind my back. You spoke to police as though I was losing my mind. And now you want me to believe this is all about love. Brian opened his mouth, then closed it again. You should go home, I said quietly. For a moment he remained standing there, caught somewhere between frustration and uncertainty. Then he shook his head once and walked back toward his car without another word. The sound of gravel beneath his tires faded slowly down the street, and when it was finally gone, the pressure inside the house eased faster than I expected. I made tea and carried it out onto the porch. The afternoon sun rested warmly against my skin. Birds moved through the hedges beside the yard. The neighborhood continued on around me, as though none of this existed. Later that afternoon, Angela sent another message. Dad would be ashamed of you for shutting us out. A cruel sentence. Precise too. Designed to land where grief still lived. But grief teaches you something important over time. People often use guilt when consequences finally reach them. I replied with one sentence. He would be ashamed of dishonesty. Then I put the phone away and returned to my gardening. The soil felt cool beneath my fingertips. Familiar. Steadying. I trimmed dead leaves, loosened the dirt around the roots, watered the flower beds, slowly while evening light stretched across the yard. By dusk, the garden looked calmer. And so did my mind. They could pressure me, accuse me, call me difficult. None of it changed the truth. I hadn't suddenly become stronger this week. I had simply stopped agreeing to things that diminished me. That evening, just after the sun disappeared behind the neighbor's maple tree, and blue shadows stretched across the porch, I heard a soft knock at the front door. Not urgent, not demanding, just gentle. When I opened it, Ethan Brooks stood there holding a small toolbox in one hand, and wearing the same cautious smile had since he was a teenager. "Evening, Mrs. Sanders," he said. "Sorry to bother you. I noticed your porch light flickers when the wind picks up. Thought maybe I could fix it for you." I hadn't even realized it had been flickering, though now that he mentioned it, I remembered hearing a faint buzzing sound a few nights earlier. "You were not bothering me at all, Ethan," I said. "Come in." He stepped inside carefully, taller now than I remembered. 21 and still growing into himself, with the kind of open kindness most people eventually learn to hide. His family had moved into the neighborhood years ago, and I had watched him slowly become the kind of young man who still asked older people how they were doing, and actually waited to hear the answer. He walked over to the porch switch, immediately, listening carefully to the faint electrical hum behind the wall. "Loose wire," Ethan said softly from the porch switch. "I can fix it in a few minutes." I sat at the kitchen table while he worked. There was something comforting about the sound of someone moving through a house with purpose instead of accusation. After a minute, he glanced back over his shoulder. "I saw your daughter's car here yesterday," he said carefully. "Everything all right?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because it was a secret. Because some stories feel too heavy to hand over casually. Still, Ethan had earned honesty the way most people never do. Simply by showing up without wanting anything from me. "Family disagreement," I said at last. "They've decided I can't manage things on my own anymore." He turned slightly, brow tightening. "You," he said. "Not managing." Then he shook his head. "My mom says you run this house better than she runs ours." The comment warmed something inside me I hadn't realized had gone cold. "Your mother is very kind," I said. "That's not kindness," he replied easily. "That's just true." He tightened one final screw, tested the switch again, and the porch light glowed steadily without flickering. He looked satisfied afterward. Not proud. There's a difference. He looked quietly satisfied afterward, which felt different from pride somehow. Before putting away his tools, Ethan hesitated. "If you ever need help with anything," he said, "repairs, lifting heavy stuff, checking something around the house, you can call me." Seriously. I studied his face for a moment. No performance. No hidden motive. Just a young man who had been raised properly. "Thank you, Ethan," I said softly. "That means more than you realize." He shrugged awkwardly, almost uncomfortable receiving gratitude. "You helped me plenty growing up," he said. "Let me sit at your kitchen table after school, while my mom worked double shifts. You looked out for me." "I wanted to," I replied simply. "Well," he said, lifting the toolbox into one hand. "Now I want to return the favor." I walked him to the door and watched him cross the yard with that same easy, unguarded stride. Above me, the porch light remained steady. And strangely enough, the house itself seemed steadier too. As though kindness without conditions repairs more than people realize. When I stepped back inside, the atmosphere no longer felt strained. Not empty either. Just softer somehow. Funny how one sincere visit could loosen tension that arguments never could. And standing there alone in the quiet, something became clear to me. Not all care arrives disguised as protection or authority. Ethan never once asked for anything in return. And sometimes that kind is the most honest of all. Officer Ryan Cole returned 2 days later, shortly after lunch, while the house still smelled faintly of the soup I'd made earlier. I saw his patrol car through the front window and felt no fear this time. Only readiness. Once someone has stood beside you during a difficult moment, you begin to recognize the shape of their presence. He greeted me with a polite nod. "Mrs. Sanders, do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Come in." He entered with the same respectful professionalism he'd shown during his first visit. But this time there was something firmer underneath it. Certainty. A slim folder rested beneath his arm. No notebook, no investigative hesitation. Just a single folder, neat and final enough that I suspected the direction of this entire situation was about to change. We sat at the kitchen table. Ryan folded his hands together briefly. "I wanted to follow up regarding the investigation," he said, "and update you on several findings." I offered him tea, but he declined with a small smile. "Thank you, but this shouldn't take long." My pulse didn't race. It simply waited. "The inquiry initiated by your daughter and son-in-law has now been reviewed by both our department and the King County Property Probate Office," he began. It was flagged as irregular. His tone remained measured. There was no supporting medical evidence, no incident reports, no documentation that would justify a competency evaluation. I nodded once. I assumed as much. "Because of that," he continued, "the request has been formally dismissed. Your records have also been flagged to prevent future filings without direct contact with you first." He tapped the folder lightly. "You'll receive written confirmation from the county." Warmth spread slowly through my chest. Relief, yes, but also something more solid than relief. Like a structure settling back onto its proper foundation. Ryan glanced briefly toward the framed photographs along the shelf before continuing. "I also included statements from my report regarding inconsistencies during our initial visit." "Inconsistencies," I repeated quietly. He gave a small nod. "Claims about unpaid taxes contradicted by your records. Claims of unsafe living conditions contradicted by direct observation. Claims regarding cognitive decline contradicted by." His expression softened slightly. "Everything I personally observed." I released a slow breath. "Thank you, Officer Cole, truly." He almost looked uncomfortable hearing it. "It's my job, ma'am," he said. "But I wanted to make sure you heard this directly. You were organized, clear-minded, and fully capable of managing your affairs." The words settled over me gently. I hadn't truly doubted myself. Not deep down. But hearing someone state the truth, plainly after days of subtle accusations, lifted something heavier than I expected. Ryan opened the folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a summary for your records," he said. "It also notes that any future complaints will require documented evidence rather than assumptions." I read the page slowly. My name, my address on Willow Creek Drive, the county seal, the dismissal notice. Everything clean, official, undeniable. "I appreciate how thorough you've been," I said. Ryan smiled faintly. "I appreciate people who take responsibility for themselves. You'd be surprised how uncommon that is." I almost laughed. "I've had a lot of practice." He stood then, preparing to leave. "If you experience additional pressure or questionable behavior," he said, "you can contact me directly. I've personally noted your case." I rose as well. "I hope that won't be necessary." He paused near the front door, hands resting briefly in his pockets. "So do I," he said. Then after a moment, "But situations like this tend to follow patterns." I knew exactly what he meant, and so did he. After his patrol car disappeared down the street, I closed the front door and leaned lightly against it for a moment. Something about the house had changed again. Clearer, less burdened. What I felt wasn't victory so much as relief finally supported by proof. The truth had now been seen, documented, and formally acknowledged. And whatever happened next would unfold on my terms, not theirs. Angela arrived 2 days after Officer Cole's follow-up visit. She didn't call ahead. I saw her through the front window. walking toward the house, with the determined stride of someone arriving for a confrontation she fully expected to control. She came alone this time. That told me enough already. Persuasion first, pressure later. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked startled for half a second, before smoothing her face into something polite and carefully restrained. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk." "Then come in," I replied. She stepped into the living room and immediately scanned the space around her, searching, cataloging, looking for proof that she had been right all along. But the room remained exactly what it had always been: clean, quiet, well cared for. I stayed near the armchair while she remained standing, arms folded tightly across her chest. She began with a long sigh. An old tactic. "I don't understand why you've made this so combative," she said. "We never wanted things to become messy. You filed paperwork to take control of my affairs," I answered calmly. Things became messy long before I responded. Angela's eyes narrowed immediately. "That's not what we were trying to do." "I read the paperwork," I replied calmly. "I read the county notice. And I read Officer Cole's report." The mention of Ryan's report caught her off guard. I saw it in the way her posture stiffened. "He exaggerated," she said quickly. "He misunderstood the situation." "No," I said softly. "He understood it very clearly. And so did I." For a moment, her shoulders lowered slightly beneath the weight of that realization. Then she shifted directions. "Mom," she said carefully, "if something happened to you tomorrow, who would handle everything? Who would know your accounts? Your bills? You think strangers would care enough to step in?" "Strangers didn't file competency paperwork behind my back," I replied. "Strangers didn't tell the county I was losing my mind." "That's unfair." "No," I said. "It's accurate." Her breathing grew uneven. "We were overwhelmed," she said. "We thought you needed help." "Help," I repeated quietly, "is something offered, not something taken." That stopped her for a moment. Not because she agreed. Because every explanation sounded weaker. Now that everything had been brought into the open, the afternoon light crossed her face, and briefly she stopped looking angry. She looked uncertain, like someone who expected appreciation, and instead found limits she couldn't push through anymore. "I don't want this distance between us," she said finally. "But you've made huge decisions without us." "My decisions are mine to make," I answered. "And your discomfort doesn't make them wrong." She looked away again, jaw tightening. "So what happens now?" she asked. "You're cutting us out completely." "No," I said. "But things are changing." She waited silently, arms folded tightly across herself. "You will not manage my finances," I said evenly. "You will not contact the county or the police speaking on my behalf. And you will not talk about my health as though I am declining when I am not." I saw her swallow hard. "If you want to visit me, you can. If you want to talk, you can. But you will not treat me like someone already halfway gone from her own life." "I am not gone." Her eyes blinked rapidly then, maybe the closest she had come to tears in years. "You're shutting me out," she whispered. My tone softened slightly. "No. I'm asking you to see me as I actually am, instead of preparing for who you fear I'll become." For the first time since she arrived, she truly looked at me. Not through frustration. Not through panic. Directly. And underneath the resentment and bruised pride, I caught a glimpse of something smaller. The frightened child she used to be. Someone terrified of losing what she loved, and trying to hold on to it the wrong way. But fear does not excuse control. And love does not create ownership. Finally, she nodded once. Small, uneven. "I need time," she said quietly. "So do I." She walked toward the front door without arguing again. At the threshold, she hesitated briefly as though she wanted to turn around. But she didn't. She stepped outside into the fading light, and closed the door behind her. The air inside the house shifted afterward. Not reconciliation. Not yet. but something more honest than what we had before. The next morning, the house settled into a kind of stillness that no longer felt lonely. It felt earned. Not the silence of being dismissed or ignored. The kind that follows after difficult truths have finally been spoken plainly. I moved through the morning slowly, returning to ordinary routines that made life feel grounded again. Opening curtains, watering plants, heating leftover soup. Nothing dramatic, just familiarity. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. I expected another argument. Instead, it was a short message from Angela. I need time. I'll call when I'm ready. No blame this time. No attempt to reshape what happened into something easier to defend. Just a sentence carrying the exhaustion of someone who had finally run out of explanations. I didn't reply. Some messages don't require answers. Only distance. I spent the next hour reviewing the documents Jonathan Reeves had helped me prepare. The trust paperwork. The account protections. The formal notices filed with the county. Each page felt less like defense, and more like structure restored where it belonged. I wasn't trying to punish anyone, and I wasn't interested in revenge. I was simply making sure my future stayed under my own direction, instead of quietly shifting into someone else's hands. Late that afternoon, the doorbell rang. This time it wasn't family. Just the mail carrier handing me an envelope, stamped with the King County seal. Inside was the official confirmation. The dismissed cognitive capacity petition. The restriction against future filings, without direct verification. And a separate notation documenting misuse of process. Nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic. Just facts preserved clearly enough to outlast anyone's version of events. I placed the documents carefully into the study drawer beside the papers officer, Ryan Cole, had already given me. I slid the documents carefully into the drawer beside Officer Cole's report. Stamped pages, county seals, dates. Quiet things that were suddenly impossible to deny. Around 5 o'clock, I sat on the porch while cool evening air drifted through the yard. Across the street, Ethan Brooks waved while returning home from work. He didn't stop to talk. Just lifted a hand casually in my direction the way decent people do, when kindness comes naturally. And somehow, that simple gesture comforted me more than dramatic promises ever could. Support rarely arrives in grand speeches. Sometimes it's simply someone remembering, you matter without needing anything back. As the sun lowered behind the trees, the phone rang again. This time it was Helen Porter calling from out of state. She said she had heard fragments of what happened, her voice cautious, trying to understand before deciding what to believe. So I told her plainly. No theatrics. No anger. Just the events themselves. By the time I finished, she had gone quiet. Marilyn, she said finally, you've always been stronger than people realized. I smiled faintly. Stronger than I realized too, maybe. We spoke a little longer after that. About her garden. The weather. The strange little H's that arrive, with age whether you welcome them or not. Then, before hanging up, she said something that stayed with me afterward. Protecting yourself isn't selfishness, she said. It's maturity. When the call ended, twilight had settled across the yard. I sat there for a while feeling neither victorious nor wounded, just settled in my own decisions. Angela would need time, and I would give her that, not from guilt, from choice. Boundaries don't shut people out completely. They simply let you decide what enters your life. You decide when they open. Inside, the house felt warm and unmistakably mine. I walked through each room once more, not searching for problems anymore, but appreciating everything I had managed to preserve. Nothing in my life had become smaller these past few weeks. If anything, it finally fit me properly again. The following week passed quietly. Not the uneasy quiet that comes from avoidance. The kind that follows after difficult decisions have finally been made. Each morning, I woke with a little more certainty beneath my feet. I kept to my routines. Tea, the newspaper, the garden. But everything carried a slightly different feeling now. Nothing dramatic had changed. Things simply felt balanced again. One afternoon, Jonathan Reeves called about the final drafts of the paperwork. "Whenever you're ready," he said, "we can finalize the trust and update your will." There was no pressure in his voice. He understood decisions like these move at the pace of clarity, not urgency. I told him I'd come by the next morning. That night, I sat at my desk, while lamplight spread softly across the paperwork. A lifetime reduced to a handful of pages. My assets, my wishes, my decisions. It felt strange seeing everything typed neatly in front of me. Not morbid, just honest. These were choices I had postponed for years, because I believed my daughter would someday protect my life with the same care I had spent protecting hers. I used to think giving more would keep a family close. Sometimes it only teaches people how much they can take. Before leaving for Jonathan Reeves' office the next morning, I opened the drawer where I kept the county documents, the dismissed cognitive capacity petition, the filing restrictions, the formal acknowledgement that the process had been misused. I reviewed them one more time, not because I doubted myself anymore, but because part of me still needed proof that none of it had been imagined. People can soften their memories when the truth becomes uncomfortable. Paper does not. When I arrived at Reeves Carter Elder Law Group, Jonathan greeted me with the same calm professionalism he always had. The documents were already arranged neatly across the conference table. "This trust keeps full authority in your hands," he explained as we reviewed the paperwork together. "What it really does is create legal separation between you and anyone who feels entitled to your estate." "And Angela?" I asked quietly. "She remains your daughter," he said carefully, "but she will no longer be able to pursue authority over your affairs without your direct approval." I nodded once. I had expected that answer. Still, hearing it spoken aloud settled something deep inside me. We reviewed every section carefully. The property protections, the medical directives requiring only my signature, the estate structure, and finally, the updated will. I held the final page for a long moment before signing it, not because I felt uncertain, because I understood the weight of deciding what would remain behind after I was gone. I named Ethan Brooks not as the owner of anything, but as the future steward of what I could no longer carry one day. A young man who offered care without calculation deserved something stable to build from. Angela would still receive family keepsakes, letters, personal belongings tied to memory. Not punishment, not cruelty, just fairness. Everything arranged honestly instead of emotionally. When I signed the last document, Jonathan gathered the papers together with a small nod. "You've protected yourself thoughtfully," he said. "It feels more like I finally restored things to their proper place," I replied. A faint smile crossed his face. "That's usually what healthy decisions feel like." When I stepped outside afterward, the morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and cool pavement, warming beneath the sun. I walked down the office steps slowly, not from weakness, simply because I wanted to feel each step beneath me. On the drive back through Bellevue, I watched storefronts, churches, and neighborhood parks drift quietly past the window. Nothing around me looked different, and yet my life no longer felt suspended inside someone else's expectations. When I returned home and placed the finalized documents into the study drawer, a simple realization settled over me. I had not taken anything away from my daughter. I had only stopped allowing other people to decide what should happen to my life. Over the days that followed, the house eased into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in its simplicity. No arguments, no tense phone calls, just ordinary mornings and unhurried afternoons. I moved through the rooms differently now, reconnecting with parts of my life I had neglected, while trying to keep everyone else comfortable. Once I stopped apologizing for existing in my own space, things began feeling different. Angela didn't contact me immediately. I expected that. Wounded pride moves slowly, especially when tangled together with shame and the realization that someone has stepped beyond your reach. When she finally sent a message, it was short. "I hope you're all right." I answered just as briefly. "I am." Nothing else needed to be said. Healing does not come from endless explanations. One evening, I stepped outside to trim the lavender near the fence line. The summer air smelled faintly of warm soil and fresh grass. As I worked, I noticed Ethan leaning casually against the fence separating our yards. "Evening, Mrs. Sanders," he called. "Garden's looking good." "It's looked better," I replied with a small smile. "But it's improving." He stepped through the side gate and helped gather the lavender clippings into a pile. He didn't ask about Angela, or the police, or the legal filings. He simply worked beside me, without forcing conversation into the silence. When we finished, he brushed dirt from his hands. "My mom's making pot roast tomorrow," he said. "She wanted to know if you'd like some." "I'd love that," I answered honestly. After he left, I remained outside for a while watching dusk settle gradually across the yard. And standing there, something occurred to me. Most lives do not collapse all at once. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They loosen slowly, one thread at a time, until eventually something no longer fits the shape it once had. But people forget something equally important. You can rebuild a life too. Not perfectly. Not into what it used to be, but into something that belongs to you again. Later that night, the kitchen had gone quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, while the finalized legal documents rested safely inside the study drawer. For the first time in months, the house no longer carried tension. Not because every problem had vanished. Because the lines around my life had finally become clear. I didn't feel triumphant. And I didn't feel bitter. I felt settled. A feeling I hadn't recognized in years. I thought about Angela then. Not with anger. More with a quiet sadness. I hoped she would eventually understand that love, without respect, eventually turns into possession spoken in softer language. Maybe she would learn that. Maybe she wouldn't. But her growth no longer belonged to me to manage. At 76, stepping fully back into the center of my own life felt less like revenge and more like returning home. After being gone too long, I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and switched off the kitchen light. Outside, the night had settled into that deep kind of stillness that reaches quietly into your bones. I stood at the window for a moment, watching darkness spread across the yard, and I felt gratitude rise inside me. Not gratitude for the pain itself, gratitude for what I had regained afterward. I had not been tested by age. I had been tested by people who mistook aging for weakness. And in the end, I learned something simple. Age had changed many things, but it had not taken my judgment. I walked slowly toward my bedroom, bare feet cool against the hardwood floor, carrying that certainty with me down the hallway. Tomorrow would arrive the way it always had, and I would meet it fully present inside my own life. If you've ever had to rebuild your peace after someone tried to take control of your life, I'd really like to hear your story too. And if Marilyn's story stayed with you tonight, I hope you will stay for more stories like this.